Maria Santos stood frozen in the doorway of the library, her hand still on the feather duster, her heart pounding as she tried to process what the millionaire Mr. Edward Thornton had just whispered from where he'd collapsed on the Persian rug. "I need to make love. Don't move," except his words were slurred and strange, and as Maria rushed closer, she realized with horror that he wasn't making an inappropriate advance. He was having a stroke, his left side paralyzed, his face twisted, and what he'd actually been struggling to say was, "I need to make things right with love. Don't move, call my daughter." And in that terrible moment, Maria understood that the cold, distant employer, who'd barely acknowledged her existence for 3 years, was actually a dying man desperately trying to reconcile with the family he'd alienated through decades of workaholic ambition and emotional distance. Maria had been working as a housekeeper in the Thornton mansion for exactly 3 years and 2 months, and in all that time, Edward Thornton had spoken to her perhaps 20 times, mostly brief instructions about which rooms to clean, or reminders about his preferences for how his study should be organized, and she'd formed an impression of him as a typical wealthy businessman, successful, powerful, and completely disconnected from the people who made his comfortable life possible. The kind of man who saw servants as furniture, functional but forgettable. And Maria had accepted this treatment with the quiet dignity her mother had taught her, the understanding that domestic work was honest labor that deserved no shame even if it received no recognition. But now, kneeling beside Mr. Thornton as he struggled to breathe, his expensive suit rumpled and his carefully styled silver hair disheveled, Maria saw something she'd never seen before in his eyes: fear, yes, but also regret. A deep and terrible regret that seemed to be consuming him from the inside, and when he grabbed her hand with his working right hand, squeezing with desperate strength, she felt the common humanity that connected them beyond employer and employee, beyond wealth and poverty, beyond all the artificial divisions that society erected between people. "Sir, I'm calling an ambulance," Maria said firmly, pulling out her phone with her free hand. But Edward shook his head violently, his eyes pleading, and he struggled to form words that came out garbled and broken. "Daughter, ... first, ... Sarah, ... before." Too late. Maria hesitated, torn between medical urgency and this man's desperate final wish, and she made a decision that would change multiple lives. She called emergency services first, giving the address and describing the symptoms of what was clearly a stroke, and then, while waiting for the ambulance, she searched Edward's phone for his daughter's contact, finding it saved simply as S. Thornton, with no photo, no endearment, just an initial and a last name, which told Maria everything about the relationship between father and daughter. Sarah Thornton answered on the 4th ring, her voice cold and professional. "What is it, father? I'm in the middle of a deposition, and I told you I don't take personal calls during work hours." And Maria, her voice shaking, said, "Ms. Thornton, this is Maria Santos, your father's housekeeper. Your father has had a stroke, and the ambulance is on the way. He's asking for you. He says he needs to make things right." The silence on the other end stretched so long that Maria thought the call had dropped, and then Sarah's voice came back, completely different, stripped of professional coldness and raw with old pain. "Is this some kind of manipulation? Is he faking this to try to control me again, because I haven't spoken to him in 5 years, for good reasons? Reasons he knows perfectly well." Maria looked down at Edward, who was crying now, tears streaming down his paralyzed face, and she said quietly, "Miss Thornton, I don't know your history with your father. I don't know what happened between you, but I can tell you that right now he's lying on the floor of his library having a medical emergency, and he's crying, and the first thing he asked for wasn't the ambulance or the doctor or his lawyer. It was you, and I think whatever happened between you, he wants to make it right before it's too late." Another long silence, and then Sarah said, her voice breaking, I'm 20 minutes away. Tell him I'm coming. Tell him to hold on." The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, and the paramedics were professional and efficient, stabilizing Edward, loading him onto a gurney, explaining to Maria that they were taking him to City General and asking if she was family. And when she said she was just the housekeeper, they told her she couldn't ride in the ambulance. But she followed anyway in Edward's car, using the spare keys from the kitchen hook, because somehow in the chaos of the medical emergency and the desperate phone call and Edward's pleading eyes, Maria had stopped being just an employee and had become a human being connected to another human being's crisis, and she couldn't just go back to dusting furniture and pretending this hadn't happened at the hospital. Maria sat in the emergency waiting room, still wearing her housekeeping uniform, feeling out of place among the worried families and the fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic and fear. And she was about to leave, about to catch a bus back to her own small apartment and her own life, when Sarah Thornton burst through the automatic doors like a force of Natura. Tall woman in her early 30s wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase, with her father's sharp features softened by her mother's warmth, and her eyes scanning the room with desperate intensity until they landed on Maria. "You're Maria?" Sarah asked, and when Maria nodded, Sarah sat down beside her heavily, as if her legs had given out, and said, "Thank you for calling me. Thank you for not just letting the ambulance take him without telling me, because I would have never forgiven myself if he'd died, and the last conversation we'd had was me hanging up on him on his birthday 3 months ago." Maria didn't know what to say, so she just reached over and took Sarah's trembling hand, offering the same human comfort she'd offered Edward. And Sarah gripped it like a lifeline and started talking, the words pouring out like a dam breaking. "He wasn't always like this. Cold and distant. When I was little, he was different. He was warm and present, and he taught me to ride a bike and read bedtime stories, and made me feel like the most important person in the world. But then Mom got sick, breast cancer, and instead of dealing with it, instead of being there for her and for me, he buried himself in work, spent 18 hours a day at the office, hired nurses to care for her, hired nannies to care for me. And when she died when I was 12, he didn't even cry at the funeral, just went back to work the next day like nothing had happened. And I grew up raising myself, seeing him maybe an hour a week, and I swore I would never forgive him for abandoning us when we needed him most." The story tumbled out, years of pain and resentment and abandoned love, and Maria listened with her whole heart, understanding now the context of Edward's desperate plea to make things right, understanding the decades of emotional distance that had led to this moment of crisis. A doctor emerged from the emergency department, calling for the family of Edward Thornton, and Sarah and Maria both stood up, and when the doctor looked questioningly at Maria, Sarah said firmly, "She's with me. She's the one who saved my father's life by calling the ambulance and calling me. She stays." The doctor explained that Edward had suffered an ischemic stroke, that they'd administered clot-busting drugs, that the next 72 hours were critical, that he was stable but there could be lasting effects, and that he was conscious and asking to see his daughter. Sarah's hand tightened on Maria's, and she whispered, "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can face him after 5 years of silence. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I can't forgive him? What if he dies thinking I hate him?" Maria, drawing on reserves of wisdom she didn't know she possessed, said quietly, "Ms. Thornton, I've worked in your father's house for 3 years, and in that time I've cleaned his study every day, and I've seen things that maybe tell a different story than the one you know." Sarah looked at her with red-rimmed eyes, and Maria continued, "Every day, on his desk, there's a framed photo of you at your law school graduation, and sometimes I come in early and find him just sitting there looking at it, not working, just looking, and in his desk drawer, which I clean once a month, there's every card you ever made him as a child, every Father's Day drawing, every birthday card, all preserved in plastic sleeves, like they're precious artifacts. And there's a folder of newspaper clippings about every case you've won, every professional achievement, and Miss Thornton, whatever walls he built around himself, whatever mistakes he made, he never stopped loving you. He just forgot how to show it. Sarah started crying then, deep sobs that shook her whole body, and Maria held her. This powerful lawyer who'd walked in like a force of nature, now vulnerable and broken and human, and after the tears subsided, Sarah straightened her shoulders, wiped her eyes, and said, "Let's go see my father." Edward was in a recovery room, hooked up to monitors and IV, looking smaller and more fragile than Maria had ever seen him, and when Sarah walked in, his eyes weren't still affected by the stroke filled with tears, and he tried to speak, the words still slurred, but clearer now. "Sarah, ... I'm sorry. So sorry, ... wasted, ... so much time." Sarah approached the bed slowly, and Maria hung back by the door, ready to leave them privacy. But Edward's eyes found her, and he gestured for her to stay. And so she witnessed what happened next, witnessed Sarah take her father's hand and say, her voice shaking but determined, "Dad, I'm angry at you. I'm so angry at you for all the years you weren't there, for missing my childhood, for hiding from grief instead of sharing it with me, for choosing work over family, and I don't know if I can forgive you right now. I don't know if forgiveness comes that easily after decades of hurt." Edward nodded, tears streaming down his face, not trying to defend himself or make excuses, just accepting her pain, and Sarah continued, "But Dad, I also love you. I've always loved you. Even when I hated you, I loved you, and I don't want you to die without knowing that. I don't want either of us to carry that regret. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to recover from this stroke. You're going to do the work of rehabilitation, and we're going to do the work of rebuilding our relationship. Not going back to how it was when I was little. We can't do that. But building something new, something honest, where we actually talk about Mom and grief and all the things we've avoided for 20 years. Edward squeezed her hand, and through his slurred speech, he managed to say, clearly enough, "I'd like that, ... very much. And Sarah, ... I'm proud of you, ... always have been." The recovery process was long and difficult, and Maria watched it unfold from her unique position as the person who'd been present at the crisis and who'd somehow become woven into both their lives in unexpected ways. Edward spent 3 weeks in the hospital, and then transferred to a rehabilitation facility where he worked with physical therapists to regain mobility on his left side, and with speech therapists to restore his ability to communicate clearly, and Sarah visited every day, sometimes for just 20 minutes on her lunch break, sometimes for hours in the evening, and slowly, painfully, beautifully, they began to rebuild the relationship that had been broken for so long. Maria continued working at the Thornton mansion, but everything was different now. When he finally came home with a walker and a home health aide, actually spoke to her, actually thanked her for her work, actually asked about her life and her family and her dreams. And Maria, surprised and touched by this transformation, began to see him not as the cold employer he'd been, but as a broken man trying to become whole again. One afternoon, about 2 months after the stroke, Edward called Maria into his study, the same room where he'd collapsed, though now it was arranged to accommodate his wheelchair and walker and, he said, his speech still slightly slurred but mostly recovered, "Maria, I need to tell you something. I need to explain what I was trying to say that day when I had the stroke, because it's been bothering me that you might have misunderstood." Maria felt her face flush with embarrassment, remembering her initial confusion about his slurred words. But Edward continued, "I was trying to say, I need to make things right with love. Don't move, call my daughter, because I'd been thinking that morning about my late wife, about how I'd failed her by hiding from her illness instead of loving her through it, and I'd decided that day that I was going to call Sarah and try to reconcile. But I was afraid she'd reject me. Afraid I'd say the wrong thing, and then the stroke hit. And suddenly I didn't have time to be afraid anymore. I just had to try. He paused, looking at her with gratitude that seemed almost overwhelming, and said, "Maria, you saved my life by calling the ambulance. But more importantly, you saved what remains of my life by calling my daughter, by not letting me die alone with my regrets. And I need you to know that I see you now. I see your kindness and your wisdom and your humanity. And I'm ashamed that I didn't see it before, that I treated you like you were invisible for 3 years." Maria felt tears pricking her eyes, and she said honestly, "Mr. Thornton, I was doing my job. Anyone would have done the same." But Edward shook his head firmly. "No, Maria, they wouldn't have. I've lived in a world of wealthy people my whole life, and I can tell you that many of them would have called the ambulance and left it at that. They wouldn't have taken the time to search my phone, to call my estranged daughter, to follow to the hospital, to hold her hand in the waiting room, to share insights about my life that helped her begin to forgive me. You did all of that because you're a person who sees other people as fully human, who extends compassion beyond the requirements of your job description. And that's rare, Maria. That's precious, and I want to honor it." He pulled out an envelope from his desk drawer and handed it to her, and when Maria opened it with trembling fingers, she found a check for $50,000 and a letter. "That's a bonus for saving my life," Edward explained, "but more importantly, the letter is a full scholarship for your daughter's college education, because Sarah did some research and learned that you're a single mother working 2 jobs to save for your daughter's education. And we both agreed that the person who reunited our family deserves to have help with her own family's dreams." Maria couldn't speak, could only stare at the check and the letter through tears, thinking about her daughter Rosa, who was so bright and so hard-working, but whose college fund was still painfully small, despite years of Maria's savings. Thinking about the doors this would open, the future this would secure, and when she finally found her voice, she whispered, "I don't deserve this. I was just being human." Edward smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually stern face, and said, "Exactly, you were just being human. And in a world where people often forget how to do that, your simple humanity saved 2 lives and reunited a family. So yes, Maria, you absolutely deserve this and more." The transformation in Edward Thornton over the following year was remarkable to witness. He reduced his work hours dramatically, delegating more to trusted executives and focusing on actually living instead of just achieving. He began attending Sarah's court cases when his health permitted, sitting in the gallery and watching his daughter practice the law she loved with skill and passion. He started having family dinners every Sunday, and he asked Maria if she and her daughter Rosa would join them, saying that she was family now too, part of the circle of people who mattered. He began volunteering at a grief counseling center, helping other people process the loss and pain he'd hidden from for decades, turning his past mistakes into present wisdom that could help others. Sarah flourished too, the burden of estrangement lifted from her shoulders, and she started bringing her boyfriend David to the Sunday dinners. And eventually she announced her engagement, and she asked Maria to be part of the wedding, not as staff but as an honored guest, as the woman who'd made it possible for her father to walk her down the aisle. Maria's daughter Rosa thrived with the stress of college finances removed, and she got accepted to her dream school to study medicine, inspired by the paramedics and doctors who'd saved Mr. Thornton's life. And at Rosa's high school graduation, Edward and Sarah sat with Maria, cheering as loudly as any blood family would. One evening, almost exactly a year after the stroke, Edward gathered everyone in his study, Sarah and David, Maria and Roseanne, he said, "I want to tell you all something important. I want to explain what I've learned from the worst and best day of my life." He looked at each of them, his eyes clear and full of emotion, and continued, I spent 50 years believing that love was a weakness. That emotional vulnerability was dangerous. That the way to survive pain was to build walls around your heart and fill the emptiness with achievement and wealth and power. And I was wrong, catastrophically wrong. I missed my wife's final months because I couldn't face the pain of losing her. I missed my daughter's childhood because I couldn't face the grief of remembering her mother. I treated people like Maria as invisible because I couldn't face the humanity that might require me to actually feel something. And all that protection, all those walls, they didn't save me from pain, they just ensured I suffered alone. That I wasted decades of possible connection and joy and love. He paused, gathering his thoughts, and Sarah reached over to squeeze his hand, and he continued, but then I had a stroke, and in that moment when I thought I was dying, all I cared about was love. All I wanted was to make things right with my daughter, to let her know I was proud of her, to ask for forgiveness, to have one more chance to be her father and Maria, a woman I'd barely acknowledged in 3 years. She saw my humanity even when I'd refused to see hers. She called Sarah. She held her hand. She bridged the gap that I'd been too afraid to cross, and because of that simple act of compassion from someone who owed me nothing, I got a second chance. I got to rebuild my relationship with my daughter. I got to meet the man she's going to marry. I got to watch Maria's daughter grow and thrive. I got to experience what it feels like to actually live instead of just existing. Edward's voice broke with emotion, and he wiped his eyes unselfconsciously, no longer afraid to show feeling, and he said, So here's what I want to tell you. Here's the lesson that cost me a stroke to learn. Love is not a weakness. It's the only thing that matters, the only thing that's real, the only thing that survives beyond our brief time on this earth. Achievement fades. Wealth means nothing when you're dying. Power is an illusion. But love, connection, human compassion, that's eternal. That's what echoes beyond our individual lives. And the tragedy isn't in loving and losing. The tragedy is in building walls so high that you never love at all, that you die surrounded by success but utterly alone. He looked directly at Maria then, and said, Maria, when I collapsed in my library that day, and struggled to say I need to make things right with love, I was talking about my daughter, about my late wife, about the relationships I'd neglected. But what I've learned since then is that making things right with love isn't a one-time event. It's a daily practice. It's choosing connection over isolation, vulnerability over protection, compassion over indifference. It's seeing the humanity in every person we encounter and honoring it with our attention and kindness. And you taught me that. You embodied it, and I'm grateful beyond words. The wedding 6 months later was beautiful and intimate, held in the garden of the Thornton mansion. And true to her word, Sarah had Maria seated with family. And during her speech at the reception, Sarah said, Most people think the person who saved my relationship with my father was a doctor or a therapist, but actually, it was our housekeeper Maria, who saw a medical emergency and responded not just with efficiency, but with love, who called me, even though she didn't know our history, who told me my father was crying and asking for me, who held my hand in the hospital and told me about the photos on his desk and the cards in his drawer, who reminded me that underneath all the hurt and anger, there was still love, and because of her, my father is here today to walk me down this aisle, and I get to start my marriage without the weight of estrangement and regret. Maria cried during the speech, and Rosa squeezed her hand, and Edward, standing at the microphone to give the father of the bride toast, looked directly at Maria and said, 2 second chances. To the kindness of strangers who become family, to the courage to love even when it's terrifying, and to Maria Santos, who taught this old man that it's never too late to make things right, to tear down walls, to choose love over fear, and to actually live the years we have left instead of just surviving them. The toast was met with applause and tears, And as the evening continued, Maria found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. How a medical emergency and a misheard phrase had transformed multiple lives. How her simple decision to call a daughter and hold her hand had rippled outward in ways she never could have predicted, creating healing and connection and new families forged not by blood, but by choice and compassion. Years later, when people asked Maria about the day that changed everything, she would smile and say, "I was just doing what felt right in the moment. I was just treating another human being with the kindness I'd want if I were in crisis. I was just being the person my mother raised me to be." But those who knew the full story understood that Maria's just being human was actually extraordinary, was actually the kind of profound compassion that changes worlds, and that her choice to see Edward Thornton not as a cold employer, but as a suffering person in need of help, had saved not just his physical life, but his soul, had reunited a family, had created new bonds of chosen kinship, and had proven that love, real love, the kind that extends across social classes and economic divides and all the artificial barriers humans erect, that love is the most powerful force in the universe, more powerful than wealth, or status, or fear. And that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply show up with an open heart, willing to see another person's humanity and respond to it with our own, trusting that compassion creates ripples we may never fully see, but that change the world nonetheless. One connection, one kindness, one moment of choosing love over indifference at a time. And that truth, that simple, profound truth, is what Edward Thornton whispered with his slurred speech on the worst and best day of his life. I need to make things right with love. And because Maria heard that message, understood it, and helped him fulfill it, multiple lives were transformed, multiple futures were altered, and the world became a slightly better place, proving once again that we are all connected, all responsible for each other's well-being, all capable of being the answer to someone else's desperate prayer if we just pay attention, care enough to act, and remember that beneath all our differences, we are all just humans trying to find our way home to love.